Welcome, everybody, to Navigating Change, the podcast from Tybal Inc. I'm Pete Wright, and I'm here with Howard Tybal.
Hello, Pete.
How are you doing, Howard?
I'm doing great.
Are you feeling good? Is your kung fu strong?
My kung fu is as strong as it's ever been, Pete. You always throw me these questions. I never know what you're going to ask. But I came back from Atlanta yesterday, and it was a good day. Except the pilot came on right before we took off. I says, "Look, we're going to go back to the gate. The brakes don't seem to be working very well." People are getting annoyed, and I'm thinking, we should all be very thankful.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Brakes are problem number one. I'll tell you, I'm very excited about our conversation today. We have over the past month, we've talked with university presidents and trustees and faculty, cultivating this dialogue around building strong relationships between institutional leaders. In light of this search for this careful balance of accountability, authority, and responsibility at the top, our conversation today is going to focus on the role of the board in helping the institution improve its decision-making prowess, to provide leadership and vision at the strategic level, and above all else, to be consequential in the ongoing development and growth of the institution. Now, I'm teasing a little bit. We have our hands on a report, the report of the National Commission on College and University Board Governance, called Consequential Boards, Adding Value Where It Matters Most. To help us have this conversation, we have invited one of the participants and authors of this report, Dr. Richard Chait, Professor Emeritus at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He makes a study of the management and governance of colleges and universities. We're thrilled to have him here today. Thank you, Dr. Chait, for joining us.
Good afternoon. A pleasure to be with you.
What to you is a consequential board?
Okay. Generally, I would think of a consequential board as one that focuses the lion's share of its time on the issues that matter most to the institution's long-term future, that then engages in meaningful and influential discussions that lead to deliberations and decisions, and then a board that monitors progress toward the intended results. So 3 parts: important issues, influential conversations, and meaningful results.
I think it's a fascinating conversation to try to pull apart what it is that makes an important issue for the board, given what we've heard about the challenges that face kind of the triangle of leadership, the board president relationship, the shared governance issues of diffusing shared governance. How do you help institutions determine, and boards, how do you see them discerning what makes an important issue that the board should have in their bailiwick?
Well, we usually start with a process where the president and the executive team propose a set of issues for the board's deliberations as matters of paramount importance. That's then vetted, supplemented, modified by the board. When I work in a longer-term engagement with boards, try to help boards be self-aware of how they allocate time and attention, and whether that synchronizes with the strategic priorities of the institution, and also help them resist the temptation to be drawn into conversations that have seductive properties, maybe of temporary or ephemeral importance, but ultimately are not critical to the institution's well-being, either in the short term or the long term.
I love 2 things you just said there that really stand out to me. First of all, the board should be self-aware and not be lured by these seductive properties. Howard, I wonder if you could just respond to those 2 points, because I think you have run into some of these very issues. How do you see boards? How do these phrases hit you in your work between boards and leadership?
And that, by the way, was what struck me from listening to Dick at this event where the group was speaking about the Consequential Boards document. And you talk about self-awareness, Dick. one of the things that I find myself attempting to do with any group, whether it is the cabinet, a board, or a particular department, is to help them think about what does it really mean to engage in the questions versus jump to the answers.
Yes.
And that's one of the things I heard you talk about that so got under my skin. It's like that's exactly what we don't do a very good job of, is keep the conversation at a level of I just saw, Dick, by the way, I was at a university out on the West Coast, and they have the signage, and the signage says question the answers, or not as opposed to answer the questions. And that to me is what I think is probably one of the biggest challenges, is not to get them to jump towards this is what we need to do, as opposed to keep raising the bigger questions. Do you find that to be, in terms of raising self-awareness, one of the bigger challenges, getting them not to jump to this is what we want to do?
Absolutely. And that's, I think that's explainable by several factors. One, these are generally people who are problem solvers daytime. And so they love to be presented with a problem and offer a solution. Second, they tend to be somewhat impatient with academic processes. Third, they are only intermittently convened. So it's not as if they have a continuous opportunity to deliberate these issues, and there is a greater sense of satisfaction that comes from solutions and decisions. I sometimes observe that many boards use the wrong RPM. They use resolutions per meeting as the way in which they they gauge their productivity. And vastly underestimate the importance of hypothesis development, insights as opposed to decisions, sense-making as opposed to decision-making. And sometimes management contributes to the process because if management has an endpoint in mind, or a particular alternative as a preferable course of action, management sometimes will escort the board right to the decision and bypass a discussion about whether the issue has been framed properly and whether the right questions are in play.
Yeah, to me, it's like it comes down to what the intent is. And if you think about how a particular university or college structures their board sort of thinking, it seems to me, I'm reading now Steve Ball's Shared Governance in Times of Change, and he talks about sort of the three ways that boards operate, or the three ways they can operate, this idea, or shared governance. Equal rights, right, between all the parties is one way of doing it. The second one is that we consult with each other, but ultimately we there really isn't engagement in that. And the third one is this idea of there are rules that we have to operate by. And in that very limited way of thinking, as opposed to his fourth option, talking about aligning priorities, which is a system for aligning priorities, which I really love as the fourth alternative. It seems to me the reason we don't go there is because it requires us to step back and ask the questions up front about how we're going to do this before we get into the subject matter. And I'd love to hear how do you find yourself being effective with a board? It's really a function of getting in there early enough where you can say, let's focus on the outcome we're trying to produce, and then discover the how we're going to get there, as opposed to what the subject matter is that we're going to talk about.
I think I attempt to differentiate or separate for boards change of mindset and change of mechanics. And the change of mindset is most critical. Boards need to consider, what does it mean to think like a trustee as opposed to think like an executive? And just as a matter of convenience and mnemonics, I've settled on the phrase oversight, foresight, insight. And those are the three roles that a board needs to play, and probably needs to play all three on most issues of of substantial significance to the institution. And again, I think boards tend to overemphasize or unduly stress oversight, the sort of fiduciary responsibility, and undervalue the power of insights, which provide different angles of vision, different definitions of a problem. So that would be the framework or template, just like Bell has 3 ways to think about boards. I try to expose boards to the idea that there are 3 very different ways to add value, and you can add substantial value in each of those dimensions.
So here's a practical question for you. You know, this idea of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink.
Right.
You're dealing with right. So you get pulled in, and I get pulled in situations where somebody recognizes they could use some help. Right. Mm-hmm. So let's say that the person that pulls you in and introduces you to the board chair, and you find yourself in a position where the board chair is really not receptive to this kind of intervention or this way of thinking. How do you go about helping turn around their being stuck in, we have to keep it structured in terms of how our committees work, and we're going to spend the board meeting updating each other, and there's no real dialogue. All there is a set of updates, and nothing substantial or consequential really happens. How do you intervene in this on the early stage? Because I think in the absence of having a chair stepping forward and saying, "I'll do this," very little can change.
Under those circumstances, Howard, I recommend someone else for the assignment. That's the first course of action. There are ways, I think, and that's not altogether facetious. I have as a matter of practice that I will not engage with a board minimally unless both the president and the board chair support the engagement and have enthusiasm. If one of those 2 parties, you use the example of a board chair, has some reluctance, then there are alternatives, and that is to determine whether the governance committee of the board or the committee on trusteeship of the board wants to be the product champion for better governance, or even to take the matter, as I've done on occasion, to the entire board and say, the board collectively has to decide whether you'd like to do this. It's impossible to be a fitness instructor to a client who refuses to exercise. And if you have absolute resistance, whether that resides with the board chair or the president, then I'm afraid things have to either get worse before they'll get better, or if the center rate of opinion on the board as a whole is at variance with the chair, then you have the possibility to go forward, although you do so with a very significant handicap.
It's fascinating to think about this, and I want to step back to your 3-word sort of mnemonic: the oversight, foresight, insight. To hear you talk about this, I hear a lot of some of the struggle that we heard from Rick Lagan, who stepped in and said in his role as president of AGB, one of the things we have to stop doing to boards is treat them as a pony show, right? This dog and pony show where we present to them and then there is a response, and so when I look at your mnemonic here, it seems almost prescriptive as a timeline, and gets us to this next question of how do we better condition these boards to support the institution of the future, right? Not just struggling through some of the political machinations that we're dealing with today, but how do we lead them to and train them to having more insight and potentially relinquishing some of the natural, as you say, sort of executive tendencies around oversight?
Part of it is issue displacement. I think of this as whales in the pool. If management can help the board see that there are 2 or 3 whales in the pool, then the amoeba and paramecia become a lot less significant, and it's less likely that a zealous trustee will mistake algae for a humpback. So part of it is to say, here's where we need to concentrate. Second is for the academics, the administration, to recognize that, in fact, most trustees have fairly substantial expertise and experience, particularly at private institutions. These people are selected because each of them has a successful track record and some particular skills to contribute, and often they're alumni of the institution. So if they're not particularly valuable to the institution, it's quite an indictment of the education that these trustees received at the college itself.
As an aside, Richard, is that is that a problem? Having front load or heavying up on alumni on the board?
It is. It has the potential to be a problem, and it sometimes is a problem. There are trustees mired in nostalgia, with an overly protective and precious view of the institution. If I could be entirely autocratic for an independent college, I would prescribe a board that's probably 2/3 alumni, 1/3 not, and the alumni would be across the entire age spectrum of the graduates, not, as tends to be the case, bunched with alumni who are 25 to 40 years out of college.
Mm-hmm.
Reflecting on faculty in this conversation and the misunderstanding that I think, or the lack of real dialogue that happens between faculty and boards. They really don't understand each other. Now, if you have alumni who may be faculty at other institutions, I do some work with some institutions where there are faculty on the boards, and it's a very important perspective to bring, because they bring the student perspective that can often get lost in the conversations. But how have you found ways to create more of a deeper appreciation for the faculty perspective and what they bring to this conversation of the evolving institution and where we want to go in our mission, and the board perspective, so that when information gets passed both ways, they can appreciate that both views really add up to a better solution, as opposed to seeing the others as more of a threat. The faculty don't appreciate the business side, and the board don't appreciate the fact that this is not a business.
The common denominator at almost all institutions is that faculty and trustees have an affection for the institution and want to attain still greater successes. Neither party should lose sight of that. I think the key is to create substantive opportunities for discussions among and between faculty, executives, and trustees. Too often, I think the parties are isolated from one another. That creates conditions conducive to the perpetuation of stereotype, to misconceptions about demonic qualities of the
how would you actually go about putting that in place? I love that idea. Would the chair and the president come together and say, listen, offline between our quarterly board meetings, we're gonna have each one of us are going to commit to connecting with a faculty member? Or how have you actually made that?
I wasn't thinking of it quite so much in a one-on-one or a social sense. I was thinking of it actually organized and orchestrated around issues of substantial significance. So I have worked with boards that have regular retreats with the faculty, and they discuss questions about marketplace competition, technology, the hallmark characteristics of that institution's education, the cost structure, with the design to exchange points of view, see where there's consensus or middle ground, to tackle an issue like offensive or inappropriate student behavior on campus. These are issues about which both trustees and faculty care deeply.
They share. So you pick a topic that they both can, and they can begin to see that that both sides really deeply value figuring out a solution around that. It's interesting. I led a faculty board retreat, and it did not go well. And one of the reasons it did not go well is that the faculty demanded that the representatives who would be at this retreat, they got to pick them. And that was I mean, the president really did at the time honored that request, and they put forward people who had more of an agenda to say what they didn't want versus how do we work better together.
Right. And there are ways to institutionalize this. There are many institutions where faculty members serve with or without vote on appropriate committees like academic affairs or student life. I wrote a piece a number of years ago called Faculty and Trustees So Much Alike, So Often at Odds. They actually have, I think, very similar characteristics or properties, and once they come to recognize that they have some of the same foibles, it's a little easier for boards and faculty to work together, particularly if the issues are far-sighted. And I think that's what you addressed earlier. So a conversation about what are going to be the most critical factors that we have to entertain between now and 2020. So it's to develop an agenda or to think about the environmental threats that are posed to various colleges and universities. So if they work together to set agendas, to understand context, a larger environment, and I find most often that their perspectives, when harnessed together, provide a sharper view of the future than either could summon alone.
I'm often asked when I'm speaking, what am I optimistic about in higher education? And I find that people get surprised when I reflect on that. I think there's more goodwill out there than we give credit for. And we end up focusing on the negative because of the louder voice, and also because it will be nice to be able to convert somebody who's negative. So we put a lot of our energy and attention on the negative story versus the good that's out there, and the fact that there's more good, that there's much less of the negative behavior than we that we give credit for, and that we give attention to. So I'm curious, when you think forward, and what are you optimistic about in how higher ed is evolving, and in this conversation about shared governance?
I have what must be a misplaced optimism, because the naysayers tend to grab more headlines and I think unnecessarily startle people with forecasts that 50% of all colleges will close. I'll take that bet publicly. And I'll take under 15% over 10 years. And in fact, if you were to exclude colleges which currently have enrollments under 1,000 students, I think we'll see very few closures. Much has been made of the fact, for example, that Sweetbriar is going to close. If 100 Sweetbriars closed tomorrow, it would represent 0.5% of the total enrollments in American higher education today. So if 3 restaurants close, I wouldn't conclude that dining out is dead.
That's good.
But I am very optimistic, because if you do take, what the French call the longue durée, if you take the long view of history, American colleges and universities have been unbelievably durable, and I have a hypothesis that they've been durable for 2 reasons. One is that they're imperceptibly adaptable. That is, they change, and the second, which is closely related, they change so slowly that they're actually resistant to fads, and that's advantageous. So you don't see colleges and universities lurch. the way corporations do.
But that's also, wouldn't you also say that that's also part of their liability, in that if they have to make tough decisions, especially around workforce,
Yep.
they are, that's not, that there's no comfort for that, except
I think there is, Howard. I assume your show enjoys debate, so let me take the other side of that.
Please, yes.
When I first entered the profession about 35 years ago, I did a lot of studies of academic tenure systems, and there are these sort of spasms of opposition to tenure. One was in the 1970s, in the aftermath of campus disruptions. Legislators thought tenure should be set aside. Then there was a whole set of questions when the recession of and hyperinflation came. Should we retrench, and tenure seemed to impede that. If you fast forward to today, less than a quarter of all full-time faculty, of all faculty who teach, are tenured. That's an enormous change in the composition of the labor force. It's sort of similar to people's notion of an Ozzie and Harriet family, or quintessential family, a father knows best family. We have changed the labor force. It is far less tenured, much to the chagrin of most faculty, and certainly to the American Association of University Professors.
I was just going to add that faculty body is now fungible to many institutions, and that creates a completely different, political environment. Certainly, when we talk about representation towards shared governance.
What I was really speaking to was more on the service delivery side, the administrative side of the house, and the continued increases of the associates and the
vice deans and the
exactly. And I think once you put roles in place, it's very hard to undo it. I mean, I understand why. So when I think about the challenge associated with workforce, do we have the right workforce distributed through the organization? I think higher ed has a hard time looking at that and making choices, and because it's very different than the corporate world. There's a certain kind of acceptance when you enter this space. It's a much more caring environment. But I think what comes with that is this sense that you have there's no longer a sense that you have a job for life, but there is this reluctance to look at performance. I think it's slowly changing. I'm seeing more and more people coming from the military, in particular from the Navy, working on the administrative side of the house. But at the same time, I think this is an area, in the absence of a crisis, a financial crisis, we let that go, and it's something that we have to get better at.
I do think we'll see more functions outsourced that have heretofore been part of the internal administrative workforce. I do think there will be, whether by desperation or legislation or some combination, there will be cost containment on the payroll side. But when we talk about the corporate side, there's, on the one hand, we do see massive layoffs, but I am not persuaded that we always see a relationship between pay and performance. And what always astonishes me is the severance package for notoriously unsuccessful executives.
Yes.
And if higher education wanted to solve that problem in a corporate fashion, go through the institution, find the 5 to 10% least effective members of the workforce, offer them a severance package comparable to what corporate executives get, and they would leave before you could shut the lights out.
Right.
This is a wonderful conversation. I think you've really lend so much credibility to this conversation. I wonder, as we wrap up, if you could just share a few words on not just what the role boards serve in the future. We've already thrown out sort of the board of 2020, but what should institutions be expecting of their boards in 10 years versus what we expect of them today?
That's a good question. I don't know whether the expectations per se will be radically different. I suspect the topics that boards tackle and the challenges that boards will need to embrace will be somewhat different by 2020. I guess what I would hope, Howard, is maybe even expect, is that boards will be much more purposeful, be much more self-conscious about allocation of time and attention. A board's greatest leverage by far is to shine attention in a relentless manner on very few issues that are each imbued with strategic significance. And I do think we'll see boards play more of a role in agenda development for the institution than perhaps is the case today. Among private institutions, I think that's going to be quite beneficial. For public university boards, I think it's still an open question.
This has been a fantastic conversation. Richard Chait, Professor Emeritus.
Delight to join you.
So glad to have you here today. Howard, final words from you, sir.
Well, the only thing I'd add to this, and just a little birdie told me, Dick, that the title "Consequential Boards" is something that was this an epiphany? You're laying in bed one night and all of a sudden you woke up and said, "I got it." Where did the name come from?
Yeah, so the birdie is correct. It's actually worse than that.
Your humility is astounding.
Yes, exactly.
It's worse than that. My colleagues Bill Ryan, Barbara Taylor, and I wrote a book which had a fair share of visibility called "Governance as Leadership," and that's okay. It's a decent title. But of course, as soon as the ink was set and the presses had started to roll, that was the epiphany for me. I realized that if we had a second chance, I would much have preferred to name the book Consequential Governance.
So you have been holding on to this and looking for the right opportunity to spring it.
I just wanted to hang this on some other movie in which I didn't star. Yeah, so I was quite thrilled when AGB
this is
picked up
behind
not
the
only
scenes.
the title, but I confessed to authorship of the subtitle as well. Adding value where it matters most.
You confess, but only by pulling teeth at this point.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a treat to have this conversation with you, Richard. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that as other issues and conversations come up, you'll join us again on Navigating Change.
It would be my pleasure, and thank you so much for the opportunity.
Howard, as we wrap up here, any final words of wisdom for the people?
No, I think that's it. We're good.
This was good.
You can take us out, Pete.
I'm
take
doing
us out.
it. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the show. On behalf of Howard Teibel and Dr. Richard Chait of Harvard University, this has been Navigating Change, the podcast from Teibel Inc.